My name is Jack Savoretti, and I am what they call a singer-songwriter. Yeah, I think what still baffles me is why there is even a small amount of the population around the world that thinks that racism is acceptable. And that's something I think that is something that really needs to be addressed, as well as the talk we're having today, because I come from a very European family, and a European family that was touched very much by the Second World War, having Jewish grandparents, having refugees on one side, and having actually an anti-fascist grandfather on the other that was the head of the partisans in Italy fighting against fascism. So I always had a family very deeply rooted, affected by, you know, any organization that was against diversity, against inclusion. My family, but by luck, I say this with a pitch of salt, by pure luck, I happen to be born and genetically tied to men and women that were on the right side of history. But it easily could have been different. Because of my culture and where I was born in Europe, I easily could have been born to grandparents that had different values than I like to have today, and that I'm grateful for sharing with my grandparents. So I think my experience, from my personal experience, is trying to understand how delicate one's history, one's own personal experiences, and also one's culture can affect the way one looks at this argument and looks at this topic, and how it's important to acknowledge one's own experience of racism, of not being, of coming from cultures that are not necessarily always inclusive and don't offer diversity and aren't open to diversity, but to not make it just about your own personal experience, to try and see beyond that and to try and educate oneself. I try to educate myself every day with what I don't know, what hasn't happened to me. Because if I base it purely on what's happened to me, I think that really narrows down my understanding and my future understanding of what inclusivity means. And too often I find people sort of only make it about their own personal experience. And I understand that. I totally understand that. I do that myself. But what I try to do is to push myself outside of that, because to truly educate myself, I need to not necessarily just understand what has happened to myself and my family and my cultural surroundings, but I need to know the experience of those who I do not understand, those who I haven't experienced. And that only comes from dialogue, not from monologues. I think cultures and tribal culture has found itself to be somewhat progressive a lot of the times at the expense of another group of people. That's kind of how I think that's sort of the way most of our societies have sort of evolved. And this is a problem now, I think, because with a globalized world, with a world that has changed so dramatically in the last 100 years because of technology, because of travel, we are learning to sort of understand our differences. And I think people are innately deeply rooted. They're sort of quite okay. This is a bit of a far-fetched way of looking at it. But again, bringing it back to my experience before I try to understand the outer, what hasn't been my experience. In Europe, in European countries and cultures, it's incredible now how judgmental people can still be based on the accent you have, because it represents the region of a country you come from. And within that sound, within the vocabulary you use or the word you use, now this isn't necessarily racism, but it is a prejudice, you are immediately classified, categorized in a certain group and a certain way, associated with stereotypes that have been used for better or for worse. Now, the problem with this is that you start identifying people rather than on character, on what they do. You start creating it on definitions based from outside of those of those groups. And that's what's happening with, I think, again now with racism, is that we are creating these sort of this identity politics that has been so powerful in the last 5 to 10 years and so disruptive. I find it's an incredibly delicate conversation and delicate subject, because sometimes even when trying to do good and get rid of these barriers, we are creating more and more groups and making it less and less about the character of people and more about the identity or the race or the sort of the way that people present themselves rather than the actual character of a group of people. It's important to me because I have children, and I have children that have taught me to see the world through the eyes of the next generation and what they find acceptable and what they find unacceptable. The same way I was with my parents and my parents were with theirs. Every generation has an obligation to improve the society in which it lives, without necessarily always pointing fingers and judging the generation that went before, because you have to sort of try and find some understanding into every generation should be as good as it can be with the information it has. And you somewhat have to sort of trust that and try not to be too cynical about, accusing previous generations of not getting it right when they didn't have the same amount of information, knowledge, and experiences as the next generation does. So the reason I find it's important is because my children expect this of me. My children, I expect this of myself. I expected it of my parents, but my children expect it even more from me because they are growing up in a world that is far more inclusive, even though there is division. It's far more inclusive than the world my grandparents lived in, that's for sure, than the world my parents lived in. And I hope that it's going to be a world that's even more inclusive than the world I lived in. And the only way that can happen is with days like today. I think patience is key. In my experience, my education growing up, I went from a very British education to then a very Italian education to then what they call an international education. And the greatest education I got from all of those three was by far the international education, in the sense that going to school every day and being in a classroom with kids from 12 different nations, speaking 12 different languages, and me having 12 different preconceived ideas of those languages, of those cultures, of those nations, and having them every day, and every day being re-educated and being shown that my prejudice or my preconception, so to speak, it wasn't really prejudice, I didn't have prejudice, but definitely I would have had preconceptions of some, maybe, were not necessarily my own ideas, but they were things that I'd either seen on TV, heard my parents say, heard my peers say. So it's really important to try not to be influenced too much by that which you are not choosing to allow yourself to absorb when it comes to information, and just stay on top of your game. Be aware. Why do I think that about that culture, about that language, about this certain type of situation? Why do I think that? Do I genuinely think that, or do I not? And by being in an education system where I was surrounded with different cultures, I very quickly learned to just take a second before thinking I knew what was going on. And a really stupid example of that, a really silly example of that, which I tell my daughter all the time, was one of the first times I went out on a date with my wife, who is very English. And I phoned my dad. My father phoned me. And we had this amazing conversation. I think we were talking about football or whatever. I can't remember. But at the end, my wife my girlfriend at the time, she turned to me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm fine." Why? She goes, "Just sounds like you've had did you get in a fight with your father? Were you having a fight?" And I was like, no, I think we were talking about the weather. I don't know. It was just how we expressed ourselves. But her preconception of communication, for example, was she thought it was two people having an argument, being aggressive, is how she had read it. But it wasn't. It wasn't at all. It was two people shooting the breeze, talking about God knows what at the time. And that is a silly example, but a small example to show you that what you might be absorbing or what you might be taking in as aggressive behavior, disrespectful behavior, or something like that might just be different. It's just different. I think music's always been ahead of the game with this. Music is a very inclusive art form. It is an art form that does not see color. It is an art form that does not see, sex. Doesn't see. It's not based on that. It's a language. It's such a universal language that, because it's such a universal language, going back to what I was talking about before about not always necessarily misconstruing a situation or misunderstanding a cultural behavior because of your lack of knowledge of it, suddenly gets kind of diluted with music because it brings it to this sort of common ground. It's a language that does bring people on a very common ground. And I think that is the magic of music. I think it's the reason that it is this mystical thing that it is, because it has the capability of doing that.